I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to our witnesses. Forgive me, but didn't we have this exact same hearing not that long ago? I think it's the fourth or fifth in the line, and I can't believe that the cupboard of Republican ideas is so barren now that in order to distract America from Donald Trump's illegal, unconstitutional, ruinous war and his ruinous, illegal, unconstitutional tariffs and the spiraling price of gasoline and the unlivable economy he's created, that we have to go back and have this exact same hearing over and over again. Couldn't we come up with something else instead? It's not exactly working to reverse Donald Trump's precipitous slide into being the most unpopular president in American history, because that's where we are. So if we're gonna have another religious convocation, perhaps next time it could be a debate between Donald Trump dressed up perhaps like Jesus Christ and the Pope of the Catholic Church, so the Pope can answer Trump's recent accusation that he's weak on crime. I never got that charge. After all, Trump himself is a convicted felon who's pardoned more than 1,600 rioters, insurrectionists, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, domestic abusers, child molesters, white-collar fraudsters, and international narco-traffickers and drug dealers, and the Pope is certainly not weak on him. The Pope has made his views on Donald Trump perfectly clear, so I don't understand how why Trump is saying that the Pope is weak on crime. Anyway, I had this idea I wanted to float by my colleagues to perhaps create some legislative progress in this field. The Republicans are afraid that Muslims are going to impose Sharia law on the rest of the population. Now, I'm not so afraid of that because we have 535 members of Congress and only 4 of them are Muslim, which makes it extremely unlikely. How could less than 1% of Congress impose Sharia law on the other 99%? And what's even more reassuring is I actually know some of these Muslim Americans who happen to be in Congress, and they're all civil libertarians who stand up for the separation of church and state. But even if they changed their minds and convinced all the Christians, Jews, Hindus, and freethinkers in Congress, who are 99% of the House, to vote for Sharia law, I'm sure someone on the Senate side, where there are no Muslims at all, would put a hold on it, like everything else that we send over there. So I'm a pretty good vote counter, and I don't think that there would be a single vote to establish Sharia law in the United States Congress or in any state of the Union. But anyway, I had this idea to take advantage of the fact that we all agree on this point. Why don't we generalize the proposition of this anti-Sharia law movement to say that the government should not be endorsing or establishing any religion in America, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Jews for Jesus, Seventh-day Adventism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, fundamental Mormonism, Unitarian Universalism, Branch Davidianism, or Hare Krishna. I was playing with some language and I came up with this rough cut, Mr. Chairman. It goes like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What do you think about that? You think that covers it? We could call the first part the Establishment Clause. We could call the second part the Free Exercise Clause. I know we could get that through the Democratic caucus. You think we could get it through the Republican conference? I'm not sure. I hope so. The problem is that we've got theocrats out there across the religious spectrum who want to elevate their own religious creeds and dogmas above the Constitution and establish them over the secular law. Take, for example, what the Texas and Louisiana legislatures recently did. They voted to endorse the 10 Commandments and post the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom in their states. I didn't even know that was necessary because I thought the 10 Commandments were doing all right after millennia. I didn't know they needed an endorsement from the Republican conference, but they went ahead and did that. Now they want to have votes in every state legislature to endorse the 10 Commandments and to post the 10 Commandments. I'm opposed to that because of the provision in the Constitution, Article 6, Clause 3, which says there shall be no religious tests for public office. That sounds like a religious test when you round up all the politicians and you ask them to vote on the 10 Commandments. And by the way, if we are going to vote on the 10 Commandments, Mr. Chairman, I do not support that omnibus Republican package. I think we should have to vote on each commandment separately. And I don't think that you should be able to vote for any commandment you yourself have ever violated, because then we'll be taking the name of the Lord in vain. One politician I spoke to on the floor about this, he said that that the 10 Commandments are the basis for the Bill of Rights. He kind of confused me there for a second. I said, well, I do know that there are 10 in each one. That's true, but let's test the proposition. The first commandment says, thou shalt have no other God before me. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's hard to see how the First Commandment dictates the First Amendment. Is Sharia law incompatible with the Constitution, as the title of the hearing is? Sure. And so is legislating any other religious text, the Ten Commandments, the Torah, or the Analects of Confucius, or whatever, any religious scripture or body. The whole point of our First Amendment is that people can go believe whatever they want. The government's not going to dictate to you what your religious worship and practice are going to be. The government is out of it. So, I did not write that language, to be clear. James Madison wrote that language. He took care of your whole anti-Sharia law centuries ago. This is a complete waste of time. And he had the right idea. Madison would be appalled that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals just voted 9-8 to uphold the compulsory Ten Commandments display in every school classroom in Texas or Louisiana. If Louisiana can do that, it can compel display of the 5 pillars of Islam. Think about that. You really want to head down that road? The states could force display of the 10 precepts of Buddhism, the Analects of Confucius, or the 5 principles of Hinduism, if you can put up the 10 Commandments. And by the way, the 10 Commandments doesn't exist as one commonly agreed upon body of law. If you go online, you'll find like 10 or 15 different versions of the 10 Commandments. There's a Catholic version, there's a Lutheran version, there's a Jewish version, a Baptist version, Mennonite, and so on. You can, if you can compel display of 10 of them, you can compel display of all of them. There could be 100 commandments. There could be 150 commandments. So look, my friends, we don't need an anti-Sharia law, or an anti-Christian law, or an anti-Jewish law, or an anti-Hindu law. We've already got one forbidding the imposition of any religious orthodoxy, forbidding the endorsement of any religious orthodoxy. It's called the First Amendment. And everybody should familiarize themselves with it, because this is a complete waste of time what we're doing here. The government cannot establish, prefer, legislate, coerce, impose, or endorse any religious doctrine. And we don't need a special law or a special caucus to do that. And if my friends understand that, then I think they will reverse course on this movement, unless the purpose of the movement is just to demonize and vilify not a religion, but adherents of the religion. But then I would have to believe that my colleagues are actually out just attacking Muslims, attacking Muslim Americans, criticizing and vilifying them for their beliefs or their way of life. And I don't want to believe that. But I do challenge my friends to state one thing that an anti-Sharia law would do that the First Amendment doesn't already do. Tell me one thing that we would need to legislate that's not already taken care of by the Establishment Clause or the Free Exercise Clause. The real threat to our Constitution comes not from adherents of a particular religion, but from turning our backs on the Constitution and the First Amendment. Our freedoms are not under siege by a religious minority trying to build a community center, but they are undermined by lawmakers who would want to turn Americans against each other on a religious basis. And is it true that religious fanatics commit violent criminal acts? Absolutely. I mean, you talk to any secular freethinker and they will say that every religion has produced religious fanatics who have committed violence. Take, for example, Timothy McVeigh, who was part of the Christian Identity Church. The Christian Identity Movement, trained on racism and anti-Semitism. He blew up the Oklahoma Federal Building in 1995. 167 people killed, 684 wounded. They blew up a nursery school. He was a violent, fundamentalist Christian fanatic, but you wouldn't blame all Christians for what he did, any more than you should blame all Muslims or all Jews or all members of any religious faith because of what one person or one crazed fanatic group does in their name. So, Mr. Chairman, I trust you understand all of that. I do hope we will return to constitutional principles, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Without objection, all of their opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Ammon Blair. Mr. Blair is a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation.
Representative Jamie Raskin delivered a blistering and deeply sarcastic opening statement, turning what was meant to be a hearing on Sharia law into a broader constitutional argument about religious freedom, political fearmongering, and the separation of church and state. Raskin opened by mocking the repeated nature of the hearing itself, suggesting Republicans were recycling anti-Sharia debates to distract from controversies surrounding Donald Trump, including tariffs, economic struggles, and legal controversies. His tone throughout blended constitutional analysis with sharp political satire, portraying the hearing as unnecessary political theater rather than serious legislative work. One of the central themes of his commentary was the contradiction he sees in conservative politics, warning against Islamic law while simultaneously promoting Christian religious symbolism in government institutions. Raskin argued that the First Amendment already prohibits the establishment of any religion by the state, making anti-Sharia legislation redundant. To emphasize this point, he humorously proposed language almost identical to the First Amendment itself. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. He framed this as the real constitutional safeguard against religious extremism of any kind, whether Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or otherwise. Raskin also criticized recent efforts in states like Texas and Louisiana to require the display of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. He argued that endorsing one religious text opens the constitutional door to endorsing all religious doctrines equally, including Islamic teachings, Buddhist principles, or Hindu scriptures. In his view, once government starts favoring religion, it abandons constitutional neutrality. The congressman repeatedly returned to the idea that America's real constitutional danger does not come from Muslim Americans or Sharia law, but from politicians willing to erode the separation between religion and government for political gain. He accused some lawmakers of using anti-Muslim rhetoric to vilify an entire faith community rather than address legitimate constitutional concerns. Raskin reinforced his point with historical and constitutional references, invoking James Madison and arguing that the framers already solved these issues centuries ago through the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. He maintained that no religious doctrine, whether Islamic law or Christian nationalism, should ever supersede secular constitutional law. Toward the end of the speech, he broadened the discussion to religious extremism in general, citing Timothy McVeigh and the Christian Identity movement to argue that violent extremism is not unique to any single religion. His message was that individual acts of fanaticism should never justify suspicion or condemnation of entire religious groups. Overall, the statement was less a discussion about Sharia law itself and more a forceful defense of the First Amendment, religious pluralism, and constitutional secularism. Raskin portrayed the hearing as politically motivated and constitutionally unnecessary, insisting that the Constitution already provides the protections needed against any attempt to impose religious doctrine through government power.